My book is based on lectures that I gave a couple of years ago at Mercer University, and it's really a book exploring how Southerners have dealt with really deep religious questions, especially questions about the ambiguous parts of life, or about explaining evil or explaining death, and how they use various characters, some biblical and some other kinds of characters, like the folkloric characters like the Trickster, to understand those kind of very difficult questions of life. I focus on the biblical characters of Moses and Jesus and talk about how Southerners use them in their songs and hymns and stories and so forth. I'll talk about the Trickster, who's a more general character from folklore, especially from African-American folklore. And I also talk about one other character, not in the title, the Absalom character, and that's a character in Southern literature, notably from William Faulkner's Absalom, Absalom. And then I talk about Faulkner's black literary descendants, Toni Morrison and Edward P. Jones, and their novels Beloved and The Known World. And these are different kinds of Absalom stories. For one thing, it's a very short book. And it's a book that is intended for a public audience, like for a student audience, because it was given as public lectures. And I think students will find, one thing I have is a chapter about the history of how Jesus specifically has been used. And it involves music, it involves a lot of artwork. I have a lot of pictures from folk artists who had various representations of Jesus. It involves music that they would know, such as Johnny Cash or Black Gospel and Black Spirituals. It involves movies that they may have seen, such as The Apostle and The Passion of the Christ and The Gospel Road, Johnny Cash's movie about Jesus. And it involves civil rights movement characters that they would be familiar with. But they're all talking about, what does the figure of Jesus mean to us? How can the figure of Jesus mean something to a Klansman as well as to Martin Luther King? How do they manipulate this historical biblical character to understand their lives in the South? Well, I think one section of it that people seem to be interested in is a kind of trickster section, and that is to say, what people go through their lives, and one section of this book talks about why is the South so religious at the one time, and yet is the section of the country that has the most alcoholism, divorce, poverty, obesity, heart disease, just about every bad thing you could name. The southern states are at the top of that. And one of the ways people understand that paradox historically is by adapting folkloric characters who explain things that, in a sense, the conventional religion cannot explain, such as the presence of these kinds of evil things in the South. And so, for example, Johnny Cash in his music has trickster figures that are really about why do I, as a religious man, find it so difficult to stop doing the things that I want to stop doing? And that's because there's a kind of voice in my head. Or African Americans take Jesus on as a trickster figure who allows them to subvert the kinds of things that white slave masters want them to do. So I think people will find that part of the book very interesting. The final chapter has a lot of, as I mentioned, particularly paintings by what are sometimes called outsider artists, what are sometimes called self-taught artists. These include people like Anderson Johnson, who now has his own little museum in Newport News, Virginia, someone who passed away recently. It involves people like Clementine Hunter, who was a very long life Black Louisianan. And one of the most striking images in the book is called Cotton Crucifixion. And Cotton Crucifixion is a figure of a black, obviously black Jesus on the cross, surrounded by angels, with a mule pulling a cotton wagon right underneath him. And I talked to the collector who originally collected that painting, a guy by the name of Gordon W. Bailey, who's an art collector in Los Angeles. And I said, it seemed to me that this was a pretty obvious kind of political statement on the part of this outsider artist, but I didn't quite have the evidence to prove that, but it just seemed clear to me that that was the case, and I had not seen anyone else talk about that with this painting. And he said, oh yes, that was absolutely the case with her, because he had known the artist at the time that he collected this back in, I believe, the 1980s. So there are a number of very powerful and striking images that I discuss in a chapter specifically about the people's ideas about Jesus, who Jesus was, what Jesus looked like, and how Black folk artists began to portray Jesus as a black man long before there was this thing in the 60s called Black theology that was a kind of intellectual movement, and they thought they had sort of created that, but I think it's really created by this kind of folk art and as well as poetry and song and other forms of expression in the early 20th century.